Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Toxic Off-Meta Builds, a series where I go through the history of the most dominant and controversial off-meta strategies over the years, breaking down how they worked and what the issues were with them. The first episode had pretty good reception, which was a green light to make a part 2, and just like before, I'll be going through about 3 or 4 instances where a champion was building what or playing where they don't normally and finding success. Someone suggested I divide the entries up by 1 in the old days, 1 during the so-called golden age of the game, to which I concur, and 1 during the modern times. Sounds like a plan to me. Let's get to it. Okay, so going in chronological order, I suppose, I did say in the first episode I plan to cover AP Master Yi in a future video. Well, the time is now. Much like how AP Tryndamere inappropriately tore everything to shreds by healing so much he made modern day sustain look balanced, Master Yi, a fellow skirmisher duelist, was another such case of a champion whose incidental AP ratios were just practical enough to make it work. Seasons 2 and 3 were a period of cheese builds and hilariously broken oversights. It wasn't unheard of for AD champions to have random AP ratios in their kits, which were primarily meant to serve as nominal scaling, in that it's there for the sake of being there, not really meant to be tapped into. You could see this in a lot of old champions, and for Master Yi, the way he exploited it was by similarly being extremely tanky while doing a fair bit of damage. As you know, his Q Alpha Strike is both his primary gap closer and burst option, with a respectably high AD scaling if you concentrate all hits on a single target. Basic attacks reduce the cooldown of his Q by 1 second per hit. However, prior to version 3.10, Alpha Strike was actually a magic damage ability, and funnily enough, it had an RNG component to it. Not relevant to champion combat, but it was interesting how there was a 50% chance to deal additional damage to minions and monsters. Anyway though, Alpha Strike had no AD scaling to it whatsoever, being entirely predicated on magic damage. The intent was that they wanted this Q to mainly be for the base damage, with you still focusing on auto attacks. In other words, Alpha Strike back then was utility-centric, not DPS. If that were the only part of his kit with AP scaling, then sure, dealing 300 base plus 100% AP wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. It's not that much different from, say, your W having the same property. What sealed the deal on this cursed AP build was Meditate. Now, current Meditate, as you know, is an active regeneration channel whereby Yi gains damage mitigation for the duration and recovers every second. Old Meditation though was some freak shit. It was still a channel, but the way it worked was that instead of damage reduction, he gained bonus armor, magic resistant health regeneration, and by bonus I mean 300 armor and MR and rank 5 and 160 HP per second plus 40% AP. Okay, I mean, sounds kind of the same as the current one, just a weirder version, right?
Oh, no. No.
What?
No.
You guys want to complain about modern champions? Oh, bitch, they don't make them like they used to. Okay, but seriously, Meditate was some horse shit. On top of the regeneration and damage reduction via armor, Master Yi also instantly healed a chunk at the start of the channel and then another big chunk at the end of the channel. Altogether, this motherfucker healed for 700 base plus 400% AP ratio. Yeah, 400. Suppose he has 300 AP, you know, a fairly modest amount. That meant a full W channel recovered something like 1200 HP in addition to the base amount. You didn't even need to have it at rank 5, even at rank 1 it would basically be a full heal. Like with AP Tryndamere, trading against him or poking him was simply not productive, since if given even 10 seconds of downtime, he would immediately recover back to full for only a token bit of mana. All the while, even though Wuju's style and his auto attacks were of no import, his Alpha Strike would stay competitive in damage, allowing him to trade against you during that time. In essence, your only option was to 100 to 0 him, if that was even possible. Assuming you had no way to stop him from channeling, and even if you did, Yi's W would block a significant amount of your non-true damage against him, effectively making him invincible for a short time. With enough ability power, this guy never died. He would do well over 700-800 damage with every Q against the entire enemy team. Said Q would completely reset its cooldown if he killed the target, not the 70% we know now, so he could just do it again and again. And if you tried to burst him, he would activate W and heal right back to full. If anything, AP Yi was even stronger than AP Tryndamere. I do find it funny though that Alpha Strike used to be a magic damage ability with AP scaling. That made no sense to have on a physical auto attacker. Moving right along, let's enter the Golden Ages, aka the mid-2010s. Despite League having been made significantly more refined by 2016, the game was still undergoing a very transitional period, one with all the class updates and such. I'm sure most of you were somewhat acquainted with, if not outright traumatized by, the prevailing and long-winded tank meta that took place between 2015 and 2017. While the likes of Poppy, Nautilus, Shen, Sejuani, and Maokai were the main beneficiaries of tank meta, because of how significantly overtuned tank items were, a number of assassins ended up adopting them as their main build. Most infamously, we had Tank Echo, Fizz, and Akali. Putting it simply, Tank Echo was just that, Echo with a full tank build. The reason Tank Echo worked had more to do with the champion itself though, and not the items, not entirely anyway. Granted, we'll talk about the items in a minute, but for Echo in particular, when he first came out, they initially designed him to be an AP skirmisher, not really assassin, kind of like Sylas if you will. He wasn't meant to be a squishy full-on one-shot or be one-shotted champ. The implication was that Echo already had measurably higher base pressure than that of AP mages. Makes sense, he's a melee after all. The problem was that the way Echo was designed made him even more effective if you went full tank than if you went full DPS. When he first came out, Z-Drive Resonance not only sped him up on champion proc, but he slowed the target as well, making him pretty much uncatchable or inescapable if he got it off, as he would gain up to 80% move speed while simultaneously cutting your move speed by 80%. Secondly, all utility-centric aspects of his kit were not contingent on ability power. For example, Parallel Convergence had an immense base shield value, and the missing health damage on each hit against targets below 30% used to be 5% base instead of 3%. Meanwhile, Chrono Break healed on more of the portion of damage dealt at base. I believe it was 30%, whereas now it's 20% plus the portion of AP. Point being, Echo just had really good base numbers in general, which meant he could afford to build tank items and win through sheer attrition. While Tank Echo would never in a million years be able to one-shot anyone, through a combination of incredible stick potential and diver-centric tools like a massive AoE stun and shield, Echo had the ability to engage onto a target and pretty much beat them down slowly over time, almost like a stat checker. Further, his kit also did a very good job maximizing the value of tank items. Sunfire Aegis, or Sunfire Cape as it was back then, offered an immense amount of value, costing only 2700 gold but giving 50 armor, 500 health, 150% health regeneration, and the signature burn aura. Echo's stick potential through E and passive made it so he could stay on top of his target for extended periods of time, causing Sunfire to deal north of 3, 4, 5, 6, 700 damage, in addition to Echo's own power. Second, you had Spirit Visage, quite possibly the most overtuned item in the game at the time, providing 70 magic resist, 500 health, 10% CDR, and 150 health regeneration for a mere 2800 gold. It was so valuable that even tanks without any healing took it for the raw stats. In the case of Echo, he had the healing from Grasp of the Undying and then the heal from Chrono Break, vastly amplifying his already high durability at that point and allowing him to duel opponents for longer. Then finally you had Iceborne Gauntlet, providing Echo with everything else he needed, 20% CDR, 65 armor, and a bunch of mana to supply him with enough gas to fight for extended periods of time. The Spellblade made running away from Echo even more difficult by giving him a massive AoE slowing field. Altogether, you had a hyper-mobile diver who could face tank all your hits, dish out comparable DPS in return, and then gradually, literally burn you down until you died. Catching him was also challenging since again he could slow you by a ridiculous amount and speed himself up, so if at any point the situation turned against him, he had an easy escape either by simply running away or pressing his ultimate. Now I know I spent most of this segment talking about just Echo, but you can essentially apply the same points on him to the other two champions Akali and Fizz. Old Akali was similarly a hyper-mobile, hyper-stick potential assassin with the capacity to fight for extended periods of time, not to mention her passive offering healing and being a manaless champion. Fizz had neither manaless status nor healing, but what he did have was percent health damage on his W, kind of like Echo, and he was also very sticky, hard to catch, could fight for a long time, and Chum the Waters used to give him damage amplification against his target, which included, I might add, the burn damage on Sunfire. During their reworks and nerfs, they specifically targeted their base numbers, lowering them but compensating by adding more ability power ratios. That's why nowadays you see Echo, for example, with insane AP ratios on all of his abilities, but relatively poor base damage and shielding, to force Echo, and by extension the others, to build ability power. Definitely not a time period I want to go back to, not at all. Actually, around the same time if not a bit later, there was a variant of Tank Assassin, although it was less tank and more Bruiser oriented. Anyone remember Bruiser Yasuo? Easily one of the most annoying builds to deal with for much of the same reasons as Tank Echo. Throughout the better part of Season 6, Yasuo became famous for building tanky instead of full crit like he was intended to, with the build primarily being centered around Trinity Force and Frozen Mallet. In other words, no crit. The way it worked was that Yasuo was able to exploit the fact that after using Last Breath, for 15 seconds his attacks would ignore half of the target's bonus armor. Despite being bonus armor penetration and not total, 50% was among the highest armor pen sources in the game, and still is now. Thanks to his Q and E having extremely short cooldowns, Yasuo was able to spam Triforce proc all the time, giving him a big boost in damage even without crit. Then Frozen Mallet gave you a whopping 700 bonus health and a modest amount of AT. More importantly though, Yasuo's auto attacks and Q applied at 40% slow onto enemies, making it easier for him to not only stick to targets but land additional Qs, including and especially Q3. Yasuo was able to stick onto targets and chase them down by layering Frozen Mallet with his dashes to basically stat check people. You'd never be able to run away from him, and bear in mind this was back in 2016 before hypermobility was a thing. He would have so much HP to face tank your hits while dealing respectable damage in return. The 50% bonus armor penetration made him surprisingly good against tanks and bruisers, so much so that to directly target Frozen Force Yasuo in 6.18, they made it so the bonus armor pen buff on his ultimate only applied to critical strikes, mandating Yasuo to build crit to make use of it. Honestly, the biggest problem with this build was Last Breath, not necessarily Frozen Mallet or Triforce. Yes, Frozen Mallet was toxic in its own right, but overall, getting free 50% unconditional bonus armor pen was the real perpetrator of the strategy. Alrighty, now to wrap it up with the final off-meta play, and we're going to be zooming all the way to the present day actually. I want to complain about Varus top. I'm sure more people would rather talk about Vayne top, but to be fair, Vayne top was always a niche thing. It never got the same kind of immediate attention that Varus top did this year. If you've been playing around this time, you may recall back in winter and spring, Vars became notorious for being played in top lane as a surprisingly practical pick. Normally, ranged top laners are cheese picks, champions that mainly exist to gamble on winning lane and snowballing at the expense of their late game contributions. Vars, on the other hand, was both a ranged top laner that cheesed a ton of matchups and was extremely effective in the mid to late game for his team. While a number of factors played a part in his top lane dominance, the most crucial one in my opinion that brought the strategy together was top lane's role quest. Ordinarily, if you want to play ranged top, you kind of have to take a combat summoner like Exhaust, Barrier, Ghost, what have you, in order to apply enough pressure to bully your lane opponent. But that of course came with the cost of being at a major disadvantage in the mid to late game tempo-wise. Nowadays, however, with every top laner being offered teleport no matter what you take, ranged top laners have the luxury to run a combat summoner and still rotate for objectives and whatnot through teleport. Varus was the main beneficiary of this. See, on paper, he was always a pretty good lane bully in top lane. With an attack range of 575 as opposed to the usual 500 you see on most ranged top laners, he could effortlessly harass you from a distance too far for you to strike back without forcing an all-in. Furthermore, he had two long-range poke tools, Piercing Arrow and Tail of Arrows, both of which allowed him to chunk you even further. Finishing it off though was that he had exactly the kind of damage required to beat the majority of champions you see in top lane, courtesy of Blighted Quiver. First, W gave him a substantial amount of magic damage, making it difficult to itemize against him since if you built armor, the magic damage on his W would pose a problem, while at the same time going full MR would leave you vulnerable to the physical part of his auto attacks, and of course the fairly high base damage on a fully charged Piercing Arrow. Neither of those were negligible. More detrimentally though was the type of magic damage he dealt. Being a Darkin champion, retroactively, Varus is incredibly good at dealing sustained damage and shredding through any manner of foe. Blighted Quiver's marks when detonated deal an unbelievable amount of percent health damage that increases with ability power. Not just that, but the active can also give him bonus missing health damage on his Q. By applying 3 stacks of light, then fully charging Piercing Arrow, he could shred you for north of 25% max health and 20% missing health in a single blow, effectively making it a ranged Garen ultimate. Then you had his ultimate, Chain of Corruption, applying even more stacks of light, so in total he could actually do something like 50% max health damage since he'd be able to detonate 2 rounds of blight. Once he started building AP, that 50% became 60, then 70, then 80. It doesn't matter if you were a super tank like Ornn or Sion, he'd be able to blast you all the same. As well, you had the new Dusk and Dawn item allowing 2 on-hit effects and 1 auto that made it much easier to stack blight. On top of that, most of the items he built gave him tank stats, Ninja Tabby's armor and basic attack mitigation, Dusk and Dawn's HP, Sonya's Hourglass, Riftmaker's HP and Omnivamp. As opposed to other ranged top laners who were very squishy, Varus was surprisingly hard to kill for a marksman. Having exceptionally high DPS meant that he wouldn't fall off in the mid to late game like other ranged top laners would. In fact, he was even stronger in teamfights courtesy of Chain of Corruption, creating the perfect ranged top laner, impossible to duel in lane while controlling entire 5v5s. Vars top was so overpowered they had to practically gut the champion this year. Right now I believe he's the worst AD carry in the game by win rate. If you take a look at his patch history so far in Season 16, you can kind of understand how broken that was. Okay, that about concludes another round of toxic off-meta builds in League of Legends history. As you can tell, the notion of heads I win, tails you lose was very pronounced in the entries I covered today. Let me know your thoughts on them in the comments down below, especially if you have any memories of your own to share. For now though, if you enjoyed the video, I would appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my first episode if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.